As the new guy at the office, Peter didn't expect much excitement beyond the usual paperwork and coffee runs. But as the months passed, he couldn't help but notice the growing number of empty desks around him. He assumed some employees had been laid off or fired, but the lack of explanation from management was concerning. One day, Peter decided to do some investigating of his own. He snooped around the break room and even searched through some files in the HR department, but he couldn't find anything that would explain the disappearances. But his curiosity only grew stronger, and he began to explore the building after hours. Late one night, he stumbled upon a hidden door that led to a dark staircase. As he descended into the depths of the building, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The air grew hotter and hotter, and the sound of dripping water echoed off the grimy concrete walls. Finally, Peter reached the bottom of the stairs and found himself in a dimly lit basement. But what he saw made him wish he had never come. In the center of the room stood a massive machine, its gears and pulleys whirring and grinding, and all around it were piles of human flesh and bones. Peter couldn't believe his eyes. He could feel the acrid burn of bile rising in his throat. He stumbled back in horror, but it was too late. A group of men in lab coats had surrounded him, holding him in place. They explained to Peter that the machine was a prototype device that they had been working on to power the city. It ran on human flesh, and they had been using the missing employees as fuel while they tweaked its efficiency. Peter's head swam, and he would have fallen to the floor if it were not for the men holding his arms. He couldn't believe what he was hearing or seeing. How could they do something so grotesque? The men in lab coats didn't seem to care about Peter's shock and disgust, though. They simply saw him as another source of fuel for their machine. Peter tried to fight back, but he was overpowered and dragged towards the machine. They forced him towards the opening in the front, despite his protests. He could feel its cold metal surface against his skin, and he knew that he was about to become just another pile of flesh and bones. But just as the men were about to throw him the rest of the way into the machine, a loud explosion rocked the room. The machine shook and groaned, and the men were all thrown back by the blast. In the chaos that followed, Peter managed to scramble to his feet and run towards the staircase. But the men were following, taking the stairs 2 and 3 at a time. He could hear their angry shouts echoing through the basement, and the hard soles of their shoes echoing like gunshots with each step they took. He sprinted up the stairs, and he could see a flicker of flames growing brighter ahead of him. He shot out of the stairwell door and raced around the corner and through the main doors out to the lobby. But when he emerged into the main lobby of the building, he was greeted by a scene of utter destruction. The once pristine office had been torn apart by the explosion, erupted from the depths of the building, and debris was strewn everywhere. Fires burned in the corner of the room, and smoke filled the air. In the center of the room, the floor had been ripped apart, leaving a gaping chasm that seemed to have no bottom. Peter stumbled out into the street, his heart racing and his mind reeling. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed, and he couldn't help but wonder if any other buildings in the city were hiding similar horrors. For weeks after that night, Peter couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep in his bones. He couldn't help but notice the wary looks of his remaining coworkers, and he knew that they suspected he had something to do with the explosion. He couldn't bring himself to care about their suspicions, though. All he could think about was the horror he had seen in that basement and the countless lives that had been lost to that machine. In the end, Peter decided to quit his job and leave the city behind. He knew that he could never forget what he had seen, but he also knew that he could never be a part of something so monstrous. And so he packed his bags and walked away, leaving the office, the men in white coats, and that abomination behind him.